This is the Washington Times front page for Tuesday, April 12th, 2022. Thanks for joining us. I'm George Gerbo. Ukraine is bracing itself for a massive Russian assault on the country's eastern Donbas region. Then Wolfgang reports U.S. defense officials said a large Russian convoy of troops and equipment was headed toward the region. Ukrainian officials are urging civilians to flee the area or risk being caught in the crossfire. Russia's decision to pull its troops from northern Ukraine and abandon its effort to capture the capital of Kyiv has raised fears that Russia will double down on its strategy of targeting civilians and non-military targets in the more vulnerable east and south. Meanwhile, the White House has upped its pressure on India to take a harder line on Russia. Tom Howell and Mike Glenn report President Biden lobbied Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi in a video call not to boost purchases of Russian oil. The conversation was the latest sign that India is an outlier among U.S. allies on the war in Ukraine. Modi called the war very worrying, but White House officials said he made no commitment to cut back India's recent purchases of discounted Russian oil. Modi told Biden he hopes talks between Ukraine and Russia will lead to peace and called for an inquiry into the atrocities committed on Ukrainian civilians. Biden tried to make the case that offering Russia an economic lifeline wasn't helping the situation. Also at the White House, the president announced new restrictions on untraceable firearms known as ghost guns. Jeff Murdoch and Tom Howell report under the new rules, gun kit manufacturers will be required to include serial numbers on firearms and follow the same regulations as if they were selling a gun, including background checks. Ghost guns are unregulated firearms made from homemade kits without serial numbers. That hinders the government's ability to track the weapon if it's used in a crime. The kits are also not regulated as firearms, so purchasers aren't required to pass government background checks. Law enforcement officials say fixing the ghost gun problem will do little to address the nation's high homicide rate because the weapons account for a small portion of the guns recovered by police. A reminder that you can find all these stories at WashingtonTimes.com/front page. Also a reminder to find our whole roster of podcasts at WashingtonTimes.com/podcasts. The petrochemical industry is on pace to become the leading driver of global oil demand. According to the International Energy Agency, petrochemicals are expected to account for more than a third of the growth in global oil demand by 2030 and almost half the growth by 2050. Ramsey Touchberry reports that means nearly 7 million barrels of oil and 83 billion cubic meters of natural gas per day will be needed by 2050 for petrochemicals alone. Greenhouse gas emissions from plastics will overtake coal-fired plants in the United States by 2030, according to a study from Beyond Plastics, an environmental policy research center based at Bennington College in Vermont. Both Democratic and Republican lawmakers acknowledge they know little about how the petrochemical industry fits into plans for a clean energy future. And finally, more than 200 companies have signed on to the Human Rights Campaign's statement this year opposing anti-LGBTQ+ bills, which include measures barring male-born athletes from girls' and women's sports. Valerie Richardson reports companies signing the statement include makers of athletic apparel such as Nike, Converse, and Lululemon. Both Nike and rival Adidas have backed the effort, including releasing Spanish-language ads that feature transgender athletes. Find all of today's front page stories at WashingtonTimes.com/front page or on the Washington Times app, and find us on any major podcast platform. Just search Washington Times in your favorite podcast app. You can also find us on Twitter and Instagram at Wash Times for breaking news, sports, commentary, and more. For Washington Times, I'm George Gerbo.